Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Peters, and good morning, Mr. Dodaro. Thank you so much for being here and for your service. I want to try to touch on three different areas. One is to follow up a little bit on the issues of toxic chemicals generally. The second is on cybersecurity, and the third is on domestic terrorism, actually. So let's see how we can do here. One of the high-risk entries in GAO's report examines EPA's challenges with assessing and controlling toxic chemicals. The report points out that EPA has made little progress on this task over the past 2 years, and in fact, that EPA's leadership has actually become less committed to addressing these challenges. Let me repeat that. The leadership has become less committed to assessing the public health threat of toxic chemicals, according to the high-risk report. In particular, the report cites EPA's leadership decision to cut in half the funding for the Integrated Risk Information System Program, or IRIS, which identifies and assesses the health threats posed by chemicals. Deeply concerning to me and people in New Hampshire that even with growing evidence that toxic chemicals are infecting our drinking water supplies, the EPA's leadership wants to undermine and underfund one of its key tools for identifying these kinds of health risks. In your view, sir, is this a conscious policy decision from the administration to ignore these health concerns, or have ineffective management practices led to inaction?
I think, we lowered the rating in leadership for two reasons. Yep. One was that there hadn't been a statement or commitment to focus on the IRIS issue, where we have seen that in the past administrations. Okay. And secondly, they proposed budget cuts in those areas. Now, Congress ultimately said no to the budget cuts and held the budget stable at 2017 levels. But they still have to execute against that budget area. So we just weren't comfortable that they've stated the commitment. I won't speculate on their motives, but those are the facts. And that's why we lowered the rating. We'd like to see more attention in that area. Yep. The IRIS program hasn't had a release of a program outlook in December 18. Right. But we had fewer chemicals on it. Some that they had started assessments didn't appear. Right. So it wasn't clear why those disappeared and whether they plan to do that in the future. So I know you have other areas, but I'll stop there.
This is helpful, yeah. and I'm actually going to follow up, and if I have to do questions for the record, or sure, I will. But in your view, what level of funding does the IRIS program need to be truly effective?
Well, we typically don't give specific numbers. That's a management responsibility in the agencies, but it has to be sufficient. Now, we make in our recommendations not only funding for IRIS, but funding for implementation of TSCA. Right. For example, they've proposed to have a fee. Now, whether the fee will cover the full cost or not. So both issues, both resource issues, are very important to focus on there.
Well, I thank you for the focus. I am very frustrated to hear about EPA leadership's failure to take this particular public health threat seriously. People in New Hampshire have really struggled to get the federal government to acknowledge the public health threat of PFAS chemicals in their water supply, and they really don't appreciate the administration's lack of urgency. So do you have any recommendations about what steps their leadership, EPA's leadership, can take today to immediately address the public health crisis resulting from toxic chemicals in our water supplies?
Yes, they need to prioritize the IRIS assessments that are put in place. They need to have an implementation plan for TSCA that has measures and things, and we have detailed out a number of recommendations I'd be happy to submit for the record.
All right, thank you for that. Let's turn now to another issue that a couple of members have also talked about. In its 2019 high-risk report, GAO states that federal agencies and other entities must take urgent action to, among other things, quote, perform effective oversight, close quote, of efforts to secure the federal government from cyber attacks. Now, we've talked about the workforce issue, but could you quickly expand on what you mean by increased oversight and what you think this should look like?
Yes. We have a listing, it's in my statement, of 4 critical areas that need attention and 10 specific actions that are needed. The first is a comprehensive national and global strategy that deals with emerging technologies, global supply chain risks, the workforce issue you mentioned. So we need a plan, and with a specific implementation plan, clear roles and responsibilities, resources, et cetera. Secondly, we got to fix the problems that are known at the individual departments and agencies. Effectively implement continuous diagnostics and monitoring and attention. When there's incidents that happen, to respond quickly. We haven't seen that in a lot of cases, and we have known weaknesses that aren't being fixed. There's no excuse for that.
Okay.
Third is understanding more of critical infrastructure protection in our country. Right now, those standards are voluntary. So the federal government tries to encourage them. There are some areas they have regulatory authority. They can be more specific, but in most of the areas, it's pretty much voluntary. And so we don't really know how prepared the private sector is to secure critical infrastructure protection, some of which we, rely on for both military and other, homeland security purposes as well. Last is improving the privacy of personally identifiable information, and also dealing with information reselling on the Internet. Congress has really only dealt with that as it relates to healthcare information and consumer reporting. And other than that, there's really no framework. And the privacy laws haven't been updated since 1974. And so we've recommended comprehensive private security framework for the private sector, and Congress passed legislation there.
Excellent. Can you speak to whether agencies, inspectors general, are adequately equipped to perform this cybersecurity oversight?
Yeah, they do. We look at what they do. We have worked with them on a methodology that we both share and both use the methodology. We're updating it now, and the IGs do a good job in those areas. I mean, again, the problem is that they keep finding the same things when problems aren't fixed, same as we do. But we rely on them to cover agencies where we just don't have all the resources necessary.
Do you think there would be a value in an independent cyber inspector general that could perform oversight both across the federal interagency as well as for specific federal agencies?
I wouldn't think that would be necessary.
Okay.
We have the authority at GAO to look across departments and agencies. They have the authority within departments and agencies. So I think there's a potential for duplication there. Just give you my offhand.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's why I asked, because the issue is we keep hearing that despite good intentions, it's not happening, that there's a list of recommendations, and the question becomes if there was somebody specifically designated cross-agency to actually also look at duplicative efforts and free up the the inspector generals to do the other work, but really coordinate across agencies our cybersecurity efforts, whether that would have value.
I think the problem is not lack of audit. The problem is lack of management, attention to fix the problems identified in the audit. I think the auditors are perfectly well equipped and are highlighting the areas. They're just not getting fixed. And having another auditor find more problems isn't really going to fix the problems that have already been identified. We've made 3,000 recommendations just at the GAO alone since 2010. 700 of them are still not implemented.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.